Don't take it personally, my brother said into his champagne glass, loud enough for the table of senior partners beside him to hear. The auxiliary seating suits you better. You always were more comfortable out of the way. The room, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York, glittering with 1,000 candles, and the quiet hum of Toronto's most influential voices, didn't stop moving. Nobody nearby dropped their glass or turned to stare. That was almost worse. The humiliation was so casual, so effortlessly delivered, that it barely registered as remarkable to anyone but me. I was 31 years old, standing in a borrowed evening dress in one of the city's most beautiful rooms, and my own brother had just dismissed me the way you'd dismiss someone who'd showed up to the wrong party. I found my table eventually, a volunteer with a clipboard, and the look of someone deeply uncomfortable with her assignment walked me past the main floor, past the rounds of 8 draped in ivory linen and centered with tall floral arrangements, past the silent auction display, and the bar cart, and the live string quartet, all the way to a narrow rectangular table shoved against the wall beside the service corridor. Folding chairs, a tablecloth ironed but slightly damp smelling, a small placard that read supplementary seatings. Overflow. Your brother arranged it, the volunteer said quietly, not meeting my eyes. He mentioned you'd prefer something quieter. I sat down. I didn't cry. I have never cried in public, not once in my life, and I wasn't going to start for him. My name is Vera. I'm 31, and I work as a brand designer, freelance now, after spending 4 years at a mid-sized agency downtown. I live in a 1-bedroom in the annex. I grow tomatoes on my balcony. I split the cost of a CSA box with my neighbor, and by every external measure, I am exactly the kind of person my brother has always considered quietly beneath his ambition. He works in commercial real estate development, big projects, Bay Street financing, names on buildings type stuff. He has been, for as long as I can remember, the son my parents shaped their entire identity around. It wasn't always a competition. When we were young, we were close enough. But somewhere around the time he got into business school, and I chose a college design program, the gap between what my family valued and what I was became a fixed, permanent thing. My mother started introducing him at family dinners as the one who's going places. She never said anything unkind about me directly. She didn't have to. The silence, where a compliment should have been, said everything. By the time my brother was 30, he had a reputation on the development circuit, a beautiful wife, and a firm with his name on the letterhead. He also had a debt I'd quietly covered during a terrible cash flow year. $60,000 I'd transferred from my savings without telling anyone. Because he'd called me from his car at 11 at night, voice tight with panic, asking if I had anything to spare. I told him to pay me back when he could. He paid back $20,000, then stopped mentioning it. And I stopped bringing it up because I didn't want to be the kind of person who tallied family against money. But I remembered, that kind of thing doesn't leave you. The gala was the St. Andrew's Foundation Dinner, a major annual fundraiser for affordable housing initiatives across Ontario. My brother's firm had purchased a table for 12, a $40,000 table, which I'd seen him brag about on LinkedIn, because they were in the final stages of competing for a contract with a provincial development authority. The whole evening was, in his mind, a networking performance. Every seat at his table was a calculated placement. His wife, his senior partners, 2 city councillors he'd been cultivating, a journalist from the Globe and Mail real estate desk, 3 potential investors. There was apparently no room for a graphic designer who grew tomatoes on her balcony. He'd invited me 3 months prior, at my mother's birthday dinner, in a tone so magnanimous it made my teeth hurt. You should come, he said, pouring wine he hadn't brought. It'll be good for you to see what the other side of the city looks like. I thanked him. I said I'd come. And then, 2 weeks before the event, I got a message through his assistant, not from him directly, through his assistant, saying my seat had been moved to supplementary seating due to table capacity adjustments. I almost didn't go. I sat with that message for a full day, trying to talk myself out of attending. But I'd already said yes to my date for that evening, a man named Rowan, whom I'd met 3 months earlier through a volunteer design project for a community land trust in the East End. He was helping them navigate a rezoning application. We'd had coffee twice, then dinner once, and there was something about the way he listened. Not waiting for his turn to speak, actually listening. That made me want to keep talking to him. He was calm and unhurried and completely unimpressed by the kind of status my brother spent his whole life performing. When I mentioned the gala, he said he'd already been thinking about going, but was glad to have a reason to make it a proper date. He told me he had some work to wrap up and would meet me inside. I wore a forest green wrap dress I'd had for 2 years and flat, strappy sandals, because the Fairmont's floors are marble, and I wasn't going to spend the night in pain to impress anyone. I walked in alone, gave my name at registration, and was handed a card that sent me to the supplementary table. That's when my brother appeared at my elbow, already holding champagne, already performing ease, to deliver his line about auxiliary seating being more my scene. I didn't respond. I followed the volunteer to the overflow table. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher and settled in and watched the room fill up around me. The supplementary table had 2 other guests, a woman from the Foundation's communications team who kept apologizing for the seating arrangement, and a semi-retired engineer from Sudbury who donated to the Affordable Housing Fund every year for a decade, and didn't seem bothered by where he sat. We talked about urban density policy and the challenges of mixed-income developments. It was, honestly, a better conversation than I'd have had at table 7. My brother caught my eye once from across the room. He raised his champagne. I looked away. The dinner service had just started. A very good butternut squash bisque. I'll say that for the Fairmont. When the main doors opened and a few late arrivals came in, I didn't look up immediately. I was in the middle of a sentence, but I heard the shift in the room before I processed it. A subtle realignment of attention, the way air moves when something important changes direction. Rowan had walked in. I've thought about that moment many times since, trying to figure out what it was that made people notice him before they knew who he was. He wasn't loud. He wasn't doing anything. He was just walking across a room in a dark suit, looking for me. And somehow the room reorganized itself slightly around his presence. He spotted me at the supplementary table, smiled. The particular smile of someone genuinely pleased to see you, not performing pleasure, and made his way over, navigating around service carts with the ease of someone who had never needed to perform confidence because he simply had it. "Sorry," he said, pulling out the chair beside me. The gardener was completely stopped. I should have taken the subway. He settled in, said hello to the engineer from Sudbury, introduced himself as Rowan, and reached for the water pitcher. Easy, quiet, completely himself. Across the room, at table 7, my brother's wife was leaning toward him, saying something I couldn't hear. My brother had gone still in a way that looked wrong. He was staring at our table. Then the man sitting next to my brother, tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who commands a room by being very quiet inside it, stood up. He put his napkin on his chair, and he started walking toward us. His name was Mr. Kessler. I didn't know that yet. I learned it later. What I knew in that moment was that he was moving with the focused intention of someone who had just spotted exactly who they were looking for, and that my brother, watching this, had gone from still to pale. "Rowan," Mr. Kessler said when he reached our table, extending his hand. "I thought that was you. When did you get in from Vancouver?" Rowan stood up, shook his hand, and said he'd been back in Toronto for 3 weeks. They spoke easily, catching up, the shorthand of 2 people who had known each other long enough to skip the formalities. I learned over the next 90 seconds that Mr. Kessler was the chair of the Provincial Development Authority's Investment Committee. The same committee my brother's firm had spent 8 months preparing a proposal for. The same contract that had paid for Table 7. I also learned in the same 90 seconds That Rowan was not just an architect helping a community land trust navigate a rezoning application. He was the founding principal of a firm called Clearwater Advisors, a real estate investment and advisory group out of Vancouver with significant holdings across Ontario, and that he sat on the review panel for exactly the kind of major mixed-use development contract my brother was competing for. I hadn't known. He hadn't told me. Not because he was hiding it. I would come to understand that later. But, because it had never come up, the way significant things often don't when you're talking about tomatoes and rezoning appeals and where to get the best laksa in Kensington Market. He was just Rowan to me. He was still just Rowan. My brother appeared at our table before Mr. Kessler had finished his sentence. He looked like a man trying very hard to appear like he wasn't running. His wife was a few steps behind him, smiling in the fixed, luminous way of someone who has been trained to smile in every conceivable circumstance. "Rowan," my brother said, voice pitched at a register I recognized as his networking voice. Warm, expansive, slightly too loud. "I didn't realize you were on the guest list." "What? This is wonderful. We should absolutely connect tonight. I've been hoping to get 5 minutes with you before the panel submission deadline." Rowan looked at my brother the way you look at a door-to-door salesman who has knocked at a bad time. Politely, without warmth. "I think we may have already met," Rowan said. "Your firm submitted a proposal in the second tranche, right? Crawford Development?" My brother's face moved through 3 emotions in 2 seconds. "Yes, that's us. Listen, I've been meaning to reach out. If you had any feedback on where we stand, even informal." "I wouldn't be able to speak to that," Rowan said. "Panel communications have to go through the formal process. You understand?" Of course, of course." My brother laughed the way he laughed when things weren't funny. Then his eyes flicked to me. Then back to Rowan. Something was calculating behind his face. "I see you found my sister," he said, with a slight emphasis on found, as though I were something mislaid. "She ended up at the Overflow table. Mix up with the seating, unfortunately. We'd love to have you both move too." "We're fine here," Rowan said. He sat back down. He picked up his water glass. "Your table seems full." My brother's wife was still smiling. It was extraordinary, really, how long she could hold it. Mr. Kessler, who had been watching this exchange with the mild expression of a man who has seen many versions of this particular scene, said something quiet to Rowan about following up before the panel closed, shook his hand, again, nodded at me pleasantly, and walked back to table 7. My brother didn't move immediately. He stood at the edge of our supplementary table, champagne glass in hand, his wife beside him, looking at the two of us the way you look at something you meant to step over but didn't quite clear. Then he said, with a kind of defeated recovery, "Well, glad you made it anyway." That was when I spoke. I had been quiet all evening. I'd sat at the folding chair by the service corridor and had soup and talked about urban policy and let the humiliation sit inside me without showing it, because that is what I have always done. But I was 31 years old, and I had lent my brother $60,000 and sat at his Overflow table and watched him cross a room the moment he realized it might cost him something. And I had decided, somewhere during the butternut squash bisque, that I was finished being quiet. "I'm glad I made it too," I said, looking up at him steadily. "It's a wonderful event. The foundation does really important work." I paused, just for a breath. "Actually, it's interesting. You'd think a $40,000 table sponsorship would come with a bit more say over where the Overflow guests land. But I suppose when you're focused on impressing the right people, the details fall through the cracks." I tilted my head, just slightly. Then again, the right people ended up finding me anyway. Funny how that works. My brother said nothing. His wife's smile stayed exactly where it was. "You should get back," I said. "Your counselors are probably wondering where you went." He went back. Rowan looked at me sideways and said, very quietly, $40,000 table. "He posted about it on LinkedIn," I said. "The whole thing, very inspirational." Rowan laughed. A real laugh, not a performance, and flagged down a passing server for more water. The rest of the evening was, genuinely, lovely. The Foundation's executive director gave a speech that made the engineer from Sudbury cry quietly into his napkin and made me feel, sitting in my supplementary chair beside the service corridor, more connected to what this city was trying to build than I had in years. We stayed until nearly 11. Rowan knew half the room, it turned out. But he spent the evening with me, and the conversations we fell into with other guests were the kind that wander and loop and don't resolve neatly, which is my favorite kind. On the way out, my mother, who had been at a separate table across the room as a longtime Foundation donor, caught up with me in the lobby. She had watched the evening from her seat. She hadn't seen everything, but she'd seen enough. My brother's walk across the room to our table, his return to table 7, the way Mr. Kessler had crossed the floor without stopping to speak to anyone else first. "Who is he?" she asked, looking at Rowan, who was giving his coat claim ticket to an attendant nearby. "His name is Rowan," I said. "I met him through a volunteer project." My mother was quiet for a moment. She has never been a woman who apologizes easily or admits to having been wrong about something in real time. But she looked at me that night with an expression I had not seen from her in a very long time. Something that sat somewhere between regret and recalibration. "Your brother's table," she started. "He was trying to impress people," I said. "I understand." "Vera." She said my name the way she says it when she wants me to stay still long enough to hear something real. "He shouldn't have put you there." "No," I said. "He shouldn't have." She nodded once, the way she nods when a conversation is over. We hugged briefly. She said she liked my dress. I took Rowan's arm and we walked out into the cool October air on Front Street, and I felt lighter than I had in years. The fallout was not immediate, and it was not dramatic. That is not how these things work. Not in real life, not in a city that runs on paperwork and process and very polite institutional consequences. It was quiet and methodical, and in its own way, more devastating for my brother than anything loud would have been. Within the week, the panel formally requested supplementary documentation on Crawford Development's financial records. A standard but pointed step. One that was triggered by a conflict of interest disclosure procedure Rowan had initiated after realizing he'd spent the evening at the same event as the proposal firm's principal. At the invitation of that principal's family member, he told me afterward that it was simply the required process, and that if the proposal was solid, the documentation would confirm it. It was not solid. A third-party audit, completed over 6 weeks, found a pattern of inflated project cost projections and undisclosed related party transactions. The kind of financial arrangement that looks like sophisticated accounting until someone qualified looks closely enough. The Crawford Development proposal was disqualified from the tender process. The contract was awarded to another firm. 2 of my brother's senior partners resigned before the end of the fiscal year. There was a short item in the Globe's commercial real estate section, buried inside the business pages, but it was there. My brother called me once, in November, 3 weeks after the disqualification was reported. He said he hoped I understood that he hadn't meant anything by the seating arrangement, that it was logistics, that the table had genuinely been full. I listened. I let him finish. Then I said, "I hope things get easier for you." And I meant it. I am not someone who wants my brother to suffer, but I am also no longer someone who will absorb his carelessness quietly, on his behalf at a folding table beside a service corridor, while he toasts his own success 20 meters away. He hasn't called since. My mother has, several times. The conversations are different now, slower, more honest. She asks about my work, about the Community Land Trust project, about Rowan. I answer honestly. It is imperfect and sometimes uncomfortable and more real than anything we managed before, and I will take that. As for the $40,000 still outstanding, I'm not holding my breath, but I am keeping records. Some things deserve to be written down clearly, in a place you can find them. Rowan and I had brunch the Sunday after the gala at a place in Leslieville that does very good eggs benny on sourdough and has mismatched chairs and no reservation system. We talked for 3 hours. He told me more about Clearwater Advisors, about the Vancouver years, about why he'd come back to Ontario. I told him more about the land trust project and the rezoning nightmare that was still, somehow, ongoing. He knew a planner who might be helpful. I said I'd take any lead I could get. Somewhere around the second coffee, he said, "You know what I kept thinking about at that table last night? How many people on the main floor were performing something? And how comfortable you were, just not performing anything." I thought about that for a moment. "The engineer from Sudbury cried at the speech," I said. "He had a real reason to be there," Rowan said. "Most of the room didn't." I have thought about that gala many times since that October evening. About what it means to be placed in the overflow section of someone else's ambition, and to discover, sitting there with your soup and your folding chair, that the overflow is sometimes where the most honest things happen. My brother spent $40,000 on a table and a performance, and what it ultimately bought him was a very thorough audit and a very quiet exit from a contract he'd staked his next 3 years on. The table I sat at cost nothing, and I would go back to it in a heartbeat. There is a particular kind of justice that doesn't arrive with any fanfare. It arrives in disclosures and documentation and quiet institutional processes that move forward on their own schedule, completely indifferent to who is watching. It arrives while you are having eggs benny on a Sunday morning and talking about urban planning with someone who actually heard you when you spoke. It arrives gently, and it lands completely. My brother thought he was deciding where I belonged. He pointed me toward the service corridor and considered the matter settled. What he forgot, what people like him always seem to forget, is that belonging isn't something you can assign to someone else. It is recognized. It recognizes itself. And sometimes all it takes is the right person walking through the door.